today's seminar, which will kick everything off, is about what we have called framings. So how do we talk about the past? How do we teach the past? We really thought there'd be no more appropriate speakers for this framing seminar than Joy McCarson and Julie Fields, both at the Ohio State University. We have been very inspired by their recent publication, which is, as far as I know, the very first textbook that really brings world prehistory together seriously with the notion of the Anthropocene. I personally have long been frustrated by the lack of good textbooks, contemporary textbooks that make archaeology in its most basic form relevant to contemporary concerns. And I truly think that teaching is one of the great transformers of society. As archaeologists, of course, we know that social change is possible. We see it in our record, but we also know that it takes time, that is something that happens across generations. And teaching is one of the main mechanisms that bring about some of these transformations. So we think this is a very important milestone in some senses, the publication of this book, and are very excited that both Joy and Julie can be with us here today. And that was definitely enough for me. And I will hand over the microphone to Julie. Please take it away.
Thank you, Felix. That was a really remarkable introduction, and I'm very inspired again, just listening to it. And I appreciate you inviting us to your seminar, because all of the things you're going to talk about are things that are near and dear to Joy and Mai's heart. And it's something that it really is the reason why we wrote this book. So the presentation that I have for today is really about teaching and how we got to the point of producing a book that's about world prehistory and the Anthropocene. So I'm going to focus on really that process and then talk a bit about the book itself and what's in it, because in some ways the framings you mentioned are very similar to the way we framed chapters in our book. So I was going to talk in more depth about those, and hopefully that will give a good context for the rest of your series. I think it might. So I'm going to share screen. So let's get that started here. And just a thumbs up from someone that they see this. Got it. Okay, and let me just put it on slideshow, make sure that's going to work. 1 second. On slideshow, okay, thank you very much. So what you're seeing is actually the American cover for World Prehistory in the Anthropocene. And as Felix mentioned, Joy and I are colleagues at Ohio State University, where we've both been engaged with teaching undergraduates and graduate students. And our collaboration on this book and all of this began with our teaching a course that has been offered at Ohio State for probably several decades. And in the American system, this course is a very common one to have available for undergraduates. And so that was sort of what kicked us off was teaching this class. So we had this problem in many systems in anthropology, at least in the American systems. There are courses that are called World Prehistory or World Civilizations. And these are courses that have long been on the books and are taught routinely. And they are very much a survey course of world civilizations. And they are taught in a format where a professor gives a lecture and students attend, and then they write somewhat of a regurgitation kind of an essay or an exam. And really the goal is to kind of learn this survey of information. And teaching this as an instructor we found to be very frustrating because it really was teaching students the wrong things. We felt that they weren't learning about all of the applied aspects of archaeology and how that could actually, help us understand the world that we live in today. So in the framework of our university system, World Prehistory was this gateway course that would lead students to take other courses in archaeology. But we found that they were so turned off by world prehistory that we were losing majors. And in our system, we really want students to be engaged with archaeology. So we saw this course as deeply in need of a complete rehab, to the point of tearing it apart completely and starting over from scratch. And after just discussing it for a while, we became aware of a course that was offered by our university called Backwards Course Design. And it's a course where professors can go and take a class on how to redesign a course for a university class. So for us, we came into this process thinking that, why do we need to change this class? Why is it important? And we rudimentarily, we wanted it to fill the need of our major for students who were going to study anthropology. But we also wanted to attract more students to what's called the general education course requirement, which is basically a course that when students engage in getting a bachelor's degree, they have a slate of courses they can take that are part of kind of a core requirement. And you, as a faculty member, you want your course in that slate because you want students to enroll in it. And so we saw that really as, a benefit for our department, in that we'd have students enroll in a course that was engaging and relevant to them, and it would inspire new majors and then be the foundation for later courses in archaeology. So we really wanted to get the students engaged. But of course, the second part of that is we want to change the world. We want students to see archaeology as a gateway to understanding themselves and understanding the world that we live in. And so why would we miss the opportunity to embed all of that messaging in a course that students are excited about, and that hopefully will push them into other directions in their own lives. So we saw this as a chance to do something good and do something with the knowledge that we have. So we set about with backwards course design, and I'm not going to talk more in depth about this, but this is a process by which you think about exactly what you want your students to learn at the outset. And so in this little graph, you see something called big rocks. And it's the idea that if you have a very large jar and you have a lot of rocks and pebbles of different sizes, in order to fill up the jar, you put the very big rocks in first. Those are the big ideas, the big things you want students to take away from your class. And then you take all the little pebbles and gravel, and then you pour those in, and those fill in all the nooks and crannies that the big rocks make space for. So you begin with this idea of what are the really core things we want students to learn. And then after that, you start going through a process of figuring out how is it I can get them to learn that. So we begin with what matters most. And then we actually go to the goals of the course. What do we for sure want them to know at the end of learning for 16 weeks? What do we for sure want them to know? And those are the goals. And then you identify objectives, learn specific things that students are going to be able to know or have a skill to do, like they'll be able to analyze a concept, or they'll be able to identify key ideas, something like that. We assume that they will learn that. And then the next step, of course, is what assignment will reach that goal? What activities will help them learn? Will they need to write? Will they need to take a test? Will they need to engage in some kind of an analysis? What will help them learn? And then the last part is the content. What are we actually going to talk to the students about? What will we show them? What material will they have? And for most professors who teach a college course, someone hands you a syllabus and a book, and they say, go do that. and you look at the book and you look at the syllabus and you kind of put it together, and then you just take off running and you hope that it works out. That is very common. That's the way I learned how to teach class. And so backwards course design is basically saying, stop doing that kind of teaching and begin with what you really want your students to learn. And at the very end of that process, you get to the point of the content of like, what material will that be? So for us, having this world prehistory course, which we thought really didn't teach students what we wanted them to learn, and the idea that we wanted to change the world, well, the really big idea, the big rock, was what matters most. And what matters most is that students learn that the past is relevant to the present, and that there are key lessons from the past that can not only tell us about where we've been, but where we're going. And archaeology, it gives us a tool to analyze those things, and those skills of analysis can be continued on to analyzing the present and our behavior now. So we felt like this is really the path that we need to pursue. So we took a class and we had a giant sheet of paper with sticky notes on it, where we wanted to figure out what students could learn. We had tables and columns. We would move the sticky notes around. It was very engaging for several weeks. And we learned a lot in the process of designing the class. So what we came up with for this class was our course goals and then the learning objectives. And you don't need to read all of these, but I will just sort of give you a highlight. We wanted them to discover the past. We wanted them to know about what archaeology was as a discipline. And then we wanted students to understand why humans have evolved in tandem with their environment. And that's where we get to the part, the Anthropocene, because that was really the core theoretical component for us, is that the Anthropocene is a process that human beings and the environment have co-evolved with. And we wanted students to have that as their core understanding of the past, because it would then, condition everything that they understood about the present. So with those as our goals, we had all these different learning objectives, and these sometimes were very specific, like they could describe the prehistoric sequences from different places around the world. We thought they should be able to understand what prehistory is. We thought they should know what archaeology is and how it works. We then felt that there should be sort of key highlights from the past. So being able to understand prehistoric economies, evidence for agriculture and the impact of how people produce food and what that meant for the transformation of the world. And then leading on to things like climate, how the growth of food production and the aggregation of human settlements would generate the trajectory for climate change, which we are all now dealing with. So we thought that all of these things could be dovetailed together in the creation of the class. So with these learning objectives, once we had figured out really what these are the objectives, then the next step was, okay, what parts do we know about archaeology and about prehistory that we can use as tools to teach students these different lessons? Sorry, my camera goes in and out. So we started designing the class, and we spent probably I think a good 2 years working on course material, and we had a handbook for the class, and we actually started to teach it. And then we got to the point where we couldn't find a textbook. We looked, we thought there must be some course readings or something out there that would fit this. And there definitely were. And in Felix's introduction, you saw some of the texts that we actually looked at and other articles. But we really didn't see anything that did the job that we wanted a textbook to do. And we finally came to the conclusion that we just needed to write it ourselves. That was really the only option. So we wrote a prospectus for the textbook, which is a kind of a statement where you describe what your book will be about. And we had a sample chapter, and we went to different publishers and tried to get them interested in the book. And in 2016, we were taken on by Thames and Hudson. And at that time, I remember saying, I really want the name Anthropocene in the title of the book. And they said, I'm not so sure about that. Because they really wanted to sell a textbook about archaeology and world prehistory, and they were a little worried that the word Anthropocene was too confusing. So the words, "The World as We Make It" was our running title for a while, and then "Making the Past" was how we had it for a while. And then finally, I think in 2018, as world politics, and we all have experienced the last 4 years and we know what happened, as things changed in the world, all of a sudden they were like, we actually really would like to use the word Anthropocene in the title. And we were just delighted because we really wanted it. So we had a meeting and we decided on world prehistory and the Anthropocene as the title for the book. So the goal was to have a new narrative about the past, about archaeology from the perspective of the Anthropocene and this idea that humans and environments have co-evolved. We wanted the book to have really relevant sections that would engage students with issues that were relevant to their own lives, to modern economies and modern existence. We wanted to have materials that were flexible. We needed things to be digital. We needed things to be accessible in multiple formats. And so we were dedicated to producing a textbook that had some online components as well. And then we wanted really to represent who we were. Both Joy and I are women. We've been engaged with academic archaeology for 30 or more years, and we wanted our identities to be a part of this book. And so we presented that also as like a part of who we are. We wanted our identity and our agency to be embedded in the book as well. And so I'll talk in a little bit about how we did that. So the book of the World Prehistory and the Anthropocene came out in, I think it was October of 2019. And so we started sort of marketing the book right around that time. And of course, then the global pandemic arrived. And so we have been teaching online and other people have adopted the book. And there certainly has been instruction, but we're hoping to continue getting other instructors interested in the book. And so we have tried to just get the message out about what this book can do. And for people who aren't teaching classes, it's also a book that is easily read. It's something that, I've sent to people just as a book to read, because there's lots of things in there that are of interest, not just for a college student. We didn't want a dry, boring book. It's got a lot of anecdotes. It's got a lot of connections to modern events. And so it's a very readable book. So in addition to promoting the past, it helps you sort of understand some sort of common ideas of anthropology that are relevant to today. So I just want to talk a little bit about just the structure of the book and a little bit about the ideas in it. And as I mentioned, this is a part of perhaps giving some of the framing that Felix has identified for the rest of your seminar. So I'm going to go through it a little bit by bit, and then once I finish up, then we'll have time for questions, and Joy might chime in as well if there's something that I've forgotten to mention. So we see this book as really a way to have a lesson in every chapter that's about archaeology. And of course, textbook publishers, they want books to be widely accessible and of interest to a wide audience because they want a lot of instructors to adopt the book. So we did a lot of things that made the book very rich in terms of applications to different regions of the world, different case studies, and we really focused on key concepts in each chapter so that students would come away with a particular lesson that was related to the Anthropocene. So they would learn a method in every chapter or multiple methods. There'd be several case studies in each chapter. And then always at the end, we would come back to the idea of the Anthropocene narrative and then any ethical or modern concerns that could be related back to the past. And so we wanted to make sure students got every chapter, they got the reminder of this is archaeology and how it understands the past. And then why is this relevant to the lives that we live today? And so at the end of every chapter, there's kind of a wraparound that brings the student back to making this story relevant to something that they may be interested in personally, or that has to do with modern issues. So an example of how we set this up, this is our what we call week 11, and that's just in our teaching frame. But this is one of the later chapters in the book, where the topics in that particular chapter are residues and the detection of residues on ceramic vessels or other objects that held beverages. We had a topic on beer and wine, the production of alcohol. And then we had a topic on ritual and politics. And if you're an archaeologist, you can see how all of those would be collected, together. It would make sense. And then in the content, we would have students would learn about how archaeologists detect lipids and isotopes and resins. They would have text, the Ninkasi text, which is a tablet that describes the production of beer in Mesopotamia, depictions of making chicha, which is corn beer in the Andes, and then a description of the tombs of ancient Ur and Jer, where there are images that are from historic, archaeological investigations, but also some photographs of tombs where the skeletons of the people in the tombs are laid out in kind of a feasting scene. And so we wanted students to see how all of these things were connected. And then in terms of we're as teachers, well, how are students going to learn some of these things? We'd have a workbook where they would try and translate part of the text for the Ninkasi recipe. They'd have readings or quizzes related to residues. And we had a variety of quiz types where they could do something online or in class. And then the Anthropocene part, we had ideas about conspicuous consumption, the idea that people feast and eat large quantities of food for social reasons, but that those do have an impact on food production, like you need to produce a surplus of grain in order to produce alcohol. And the need for that kind of feasting creates the requirement of surplus food production. So that has a very anthropogenic effect. And then other things like human beings being able to preserve food by making alcohol, that it's a way to preserve calories, and what that means for the growth of populations. And then also with conspicuous consumption, we talk about human sacrifice, and there are many examples. And so we allow students to think about, consumption is not just about food, it's about all kinds of things in society. And how is that relevant to today in ways that, we consume information or media. And then the learning objectives would be, we'd want students to come away with particular knowledge about the impact of agriculture, particular histories, how you can analyze artifacts to understand human behavior. So we had very much a sequence for every chapter where we pulled these things together. And in the class, we do it very much in a very sequenced manner so that students get these little pieces of information that hopefully are connected and that bring them back to the idea of the Anthropocene. So some of the things that we have that we use in teaching this class, we're in a university, and like a lot of universities, we have some teaching collections that include stone tools, bone, pottery, other replicas that are made out of plastic and plaster. So we do in class what we call practica, where the students come in and handle artifacts and are able to do a lesson in person where they're touching the artifacts. Since we've gone online, we do that digitally now, where we do video. We can sometimes, we can't let them touch the artifacts, but we do a video representation. We also have workbooks where there'll be data sets for them to analyze on paper. And then they can try and do some analyses and come up with a writing sample or something that they're analyzing. And then in class, we also had a lot of discussions, and we still do that online with Zoom, and students write response essays to particular questions. So we would have things like, how would you survive the Ice Age? Or how might we consider ethical issues for artifacts that are in museums? So we would have essays where we ask the students to take a stand and have an opinion about something. And we would encourage them to be to have a personal view, not just regurgitate facts or find stuff on the internet, on Wikipedia, but actually tell us what they thought. Because that was a way for us to engage them with the issues of the Anthropocene. To make it relevant for them, we asked them to have it be a response of their own ideas and what they were thinking. So just to sort of like pull it together in terms of who we are and then how this all worked out in the end, Joy and I traded chapters of the book back and forth. We worked on different components of the class. Then when we sent the book to Thames and Hudson as chapters, we had a fantastic editor, Mark Sapwell, who would read our chapters and come back with great ideas for other things to either highlight or help us sort of like edit the text. We really wanted anecdotes, our personal anecdotes in the book. And so they helped us edit those. I talked about accidentally getting pregnant when I was 40 and about how that changed my life. So to talk about my identity and my agency. We had other things about going on survey and getting lost. Other things about our personal experiences of just being women. So we wanted the book to have a very personal feel. And Mark and the editorial team at Thames and Hudson were very good at helping us kind of pull that into a dialogue that was, accessible to students. And then the other people we have listed there and also in photos, those are just our colleagues that read chapter pieces, gave us ideas, allowed us to manage this project and produce the book. It was an incredible effort, and we're very proud of the book. And we think that, we hope more people will adopt it or at least just read it because it gives you, I think, even if you only read a bit of it, a couple pieces you could enjoy or apply to a teaching something, some topic. All right, so let me just cover the table of contents briefly. And then I'm going to just go through the chapters of the book, and I'm not going to talk at length about them because I'm sure people are ready to ask questions, but I'll just give you a little synthesis. And then we'll be ready to sort of, think about other parts that might be applicable for the rest of your seminar. So we have an intro to archaeology and the Anthropocene because students sometimes haven't heard that word or they've heard it, but they're not sure what it means. So we talk about what the Anthropocene is. We talk about discovering diversity, that is the human, the diversity of humans and understanding who we are. We talk about technology, and I framed this as technology makes the human, how our technologies have formed our bodies and our minds. We then focused on peopling the world, how excavations have allowed us to understand a bit about what the past was, and then some of the issues of the Anthropocene that began very early, such as extinctions. We have a big section on understanding why people choose certain things and how choice is really relevant to understanding the trajectory of the Anthropocene. We start that in chapter 7. And then we continue on to focus on producing food, the growth of society and individualism, how societies can actually ramp up production of food and what the anthropogenic impact of that is. And then other things that are about us as humans, things like building monuments and consuming conspicuous things like gold and goods, and how that is then recorded with writing and other documents. The last two chapters, extracting the modern world, are really focused on extractivism and how modern sort of late prehistory, early historic sequence, the rise of colonialism and extractive economies have extracted things like gold, slaves, mining, modern mining. All of those things are part of really the ramping up of the Anthropocene. And then the final chapter is about the future. So I'm just going to show you that the first page of each chapter, so you can just see the picture, and I'll talk a little bit about the highlights, and then continue on for questions. I work in Pacific Islands. I'm a Pacific Islands archaeologist. I've worked in Fiji for over 25 years. I went to school at the University of Hawaii. And the Pacific Islands are at the forefront of climate change and sea level rise and acidification and destruction of reefs. And so I really wanted the Pacific Islands to center in our book. And so our cover in the American version and this cover page is of a moai, which is a figure that represents the ancestors that are on Rapa Nui, which is also called Easter Island. And there have been so many stories about Rapa Nui, about the island being destroyed by people, and the toppling of the statues is this great, it's been used as a parable by Jared Diamond for the collapse of modern society. Pacific Island archaeologists don't agree with that story, because really the story of Rapa Nui is one of resilience and one of the transformation of an island in very much the sort of the crucible of the Anthropocene, but the transformation of an island into a place that actually could sustain a population for a long time. And so I was really wanting to see that particular story told, because that is the story that students need to pull away, is that not that we are destroying the world, but we can find ways to make things balance and work. And we have to have that presented at the front. So we begin with archaeology and the Anthropocene and this image of the ancestors, the moai, sort of gazing on at the start of our book. In the next chapter, we talk about understanding modern human origins. We don't spend as much time on the evolution of humans because we really wanted this to focus on modern humans. So we begin with the Pleistocene, with the first study of modern humans and their very closest relatives. So we talk about Neanderthals and Denisovans, and we really give students the introduction to what humanity is. And we talk about art, and we talk about expression, and we talk about culture. So it's really the beginnings of what makes us us for our second chapter. Our third chapter is about the sort of the nuts and bolts of archaeology. So we talk about making tools and how metalworking and perishables are something that archaeology can investigate. And this is really the beginning of how did people start to transform the world. We have a couple sections in there about the environment and how stone tools have been, in some ways, the most common material ever used by humans. And it's essential to the transformation of our planet. And so we talk about understanding that technology and what it means to the Anthropocene. And then moving into the fourth chapter, we talk about how modern humans traveled around the world. And again, since I work in Pacific Islands, which is the home of the greatest voyagers ever, we have a lot of discussion of long distance travel by humans, reaching the Americas, reaching the Pacific, and then how archaeologists have detected the dispersal of humans around the world. So we have a big section on survey and all of the techniques of actually detection of colonization of islands or other places. So that's a very methodological in focus. And then, of course, we can't not talk about digging, right? So because students take an archaeology class and they think it's all about digging. So we have a section called Digging In, which really is a focus on understanding climate change and the effects of changing climate on sedentary societies. We focus this chapter on what are the methods of excavation, but really how do we understand people's engagement with the environment? And in this chapter, we have a focus on the American Southwest, because there's a lot of knowledge and understanding from both indigenous perspectives and archaeologists about how people engage with a changing environment and how they did in the past as well. So this chapter really goes in depth into how that relationship forms and what it means, and the trajectory of an anthropogenic landscape. Our sixth chapter, we talk about extinction, and we focus on some of the methods by which we detect different changes in the past. We talk about radiocarbon dating. We talk about understanding what it is to be extinct and how that transforms the way either people engage with their environment or the trajectory of particular societies. So we really have a lot of stories in this chapter about how people have started to create a transition from the wild world that humans evolved in to a world that was much more manufactured, and where extinctions really play a role in that world. And of course, there's a message in there because that's what we're going through now. And so we wanted to make extinction as a topic a focal point for students to think about what is the effect of the extinctions of today, and where is that going. Chapter 7 was about human agency, how people make decisions. And we really wanted to have a couple cases in there where we can see how people made choices. So we talk about hunting and gathering, but we also talk about conflict, why people build fortifications, why they make choices to fight with one another. We have a historic section in there about the abandonment of an island called St. Kilda, which is in the North Atlantic. And it's a community that voted to evacuate themselves in the historic period. And by doing that, they were a very tight-knit community for centuries. And once they voted to leave, they were completely pulled apart forever. And so we talked about how that decision had the effect of taking their society from cohesiveness to, utter isolation. So we had that as like an example of a decision that students could find to be tangible, that they could understand. Because of course, everyone makes decisions in life and they end up going off on some path. So we talked about how those processes work and how archaeologists understand them. We had a whole large chapter on producing food, because how could we not? So we talked about domestication. Joy is an archaeobotanist, so she had a great deal of insight into the process of plant domestication and how the production of food changes both societies and changes the world around us. So we wanted students to understand really what that process was and what that meant for the trajectory of our whole planet, because everything around us now is an environment that has been generated in part by the need to produce food in the past. And students need to know that everything they see today, this modern world, is one that was manufactured by farmers, and that has produced a pathway for us that we need to understand and make relevant for students. So we had a very large section on that. Our chapter 9 is about agency. We want students to understand that they have a choice, that your choices matter. So in the previous chapter, we had talked about people making decisions. Agency is about the direction of individuals. So we had personal stories in this chapter from the past. One of the stories was by the woman who was the translator for Hernando Cortez when he invaded Mexico and engaged with the Aztecs. So we talk about her choices as a person. We also talked about structural violence and inequality in the Andes. And so we wanted to sort of have students learn the really human, the impact of the human experience on a person's life, and as much as archaeology could tell us. So this chapter is very much about an individual and stories and how archaeology can detect something about an individual. Chapter 10 is about urbanism and agriculture and how large cities form, how we know about food production at the grand scale and what that means for the beginnings of state level societies. And this is somewhat more like the classic world prehistory, but we really wanted to talk about the Anthropocene and what it means for that transition to a state level society in terms of what is the coevolution of the environment and the state. And then in 11, we talked about monuments. There are so many things like the pyramids and Stonehenge, all of these collective monuments that people produce for a variety of reasons. And we wanted to talk about both the growth of social identity, but also how the generation of the Anthropocene sort of led to this focus on monuments and focus on permanence of place, focus on identity that's tied to landscape, tied to the investment of food production. And so this chapter really focuses on the growth of monuments and what they mean. And then as I already mentioned, we talked about conspicuous consumption, so feasting, burials, the detection of residues and alcohol, and how that's related to the cohesiveness of communities and what that means in terms of moving forward. And then writing, we have to talk about how did we keep track? What does it mean to have information that is recorded? We tried to make this relevant to students who are used to seeing the world through their phones. And we wanted them to understand about how this information and how writing was really focused on note keeping and record keeping and keeping track of information long before it was focused on literature and dialogue and communication. It was a device for keeping track of productivity. And so we wanted students to understand different kinds of writing and how archaeologists study them, but also what it would mean in terms of what is the use of information today? What do you use information for? What do you use writing for? How is that tied to where we're going? Because information, as we know now, has incredible power. And are you aware of that power and how are you using it? So this chapter on writing was really about trying to get students to connect that prehistory of writing with the modern world of digital information. Chapter 14 is our sort of more historic chapter about fishing, mining, and the extraction of slave labor from Africa and sort of the growth of global economics. And we focused a bit on the oceans because for food production on land, you do create niches, you create microhabitats for other organisms as a product of domesticating plants and building gardens and that kind of thing. But with fishing and collecting things like whales and other things, it's purely an extractive technology. You don't give anything back to the ocean when you pull everything out of it. So we wanted students to understand the role of the human impact on the ocean and how the Anthropocene experience of the ocean is much different from that of the land. And so we focus on extractivism, and then that led us also to focusing on extracting people and materials and mining and all of the things that are tied up with the production of goods that are used for other things and the growth of capital economies. And then that's the end. We talked then about the future. The final chapter was about trying to get students to see hope. We wanted them to understand that these trajectories are not all doom and gloom stories, that there's a lot of resilience and sustainability in the past, that people solved problems, and when they could detect that things needed to be changed, they did change them, and that those are all a part of the human experience and a part of who we are. And we wanted students to feel that. So this chapter is really about the major issues of the Anthropocene, extinctions, population growth, fossil fuel consumption, but also we wanted them to feel agency, that they had a role to play as a part of, members of modern human society. So this last chapter, we wanted to end up on a hopeful note. And so we hope that it did. And that's the end of my summary of the book. The book is produced by Thames and Hudson, and I believe a link is going to be shared or has been, but you can look it up online. It's just called World Prehistory and the Anthropocene. It's at Thames and Hudson, which is also published by Norton.